Hello everyone! It's been some time since I've done a video talking about something video game related. My previous videos have just been all about, pro wrestling. But you know what? I got the perfect thing to talk about. Something more along the lines of, the whole Twisted Metal Black is like a remake of the first Twisted Metal thing. Something I think a lot of people out there might find interesting. Something I've never really heard anything about, so I don't know if I'm the only person who's ever thought of it or noticed it. Who knows? Just another interesting thing I'd like to put out there. And that is, the question I'd like to ask everyone is, has anyone ever noticed the really odd similarities between House of the Dead and Resident Evil? And I'm just talking about, the video games. Sega's House of the Dead, the original light gun arcade shooter, and Capcom's survival horror game Resident Evil from the Sony PlayStation. Has anyone ever noticed the really odd similarities between those games? Never heard anyone bring up the similarities between those games. And you'd be thinking, besides zombies, what do those two games have in common? They're completely different. Well, I'll tell you what they have in common. And in the end, some of you out there may be thinking somebody ripped off someone. Before I begin, I have to say that wherever the name of the video is, up or down there, the name of this video may be a little misleading. I'm not here to talk about which one is better or anything. I just really didn't know what to name this video, and I didn't want to make a name that was too long, so I'm not here to talk about which game is better. It's obvious, it's House of the Dead. It's one of the best video games ever. I would so put it in top 10 greatest video games of all time. But that's neither here nor there. Anyway, it's time to talk about the similarities between House of the Dead and Resident Evil. Here we go. Similarity number 1. Zombie game that takes place in a big-ass mansion. You'd be thinking, that's gotta be it, right? I mean, both are just, basically haunted house games. You fight zombies and, other monsters as well. Resident Evil stuff like zombie dog things and House of the Dead things like big-ass crab, bug, whatever the fuck the third boss of the game was. You fight zombies and other monsters. Horrifying sights. But that's not the only similarity. Similarity number 2. A secret laboratory in both mansions of each game, where the monsters come from. Now, technically, the laboratory in the House of the Dead may not be secret. I don't know, maybe people already know that Dr. Curien works from his mansion, I don't know. But the point is, both games, not only do you deal with zombies and other horrifying monsters in a big-ass mansion, but there's a laboratory you eventually venture into, and you find out that's basically where the zombies and monsters started. Now, I understand House of the Dead, the laboratory in the mansion is abandoned, where in Resident Evil, the mansion and the laboratory is abandoned, where in House of the Dead it really isn't, but I think you get my first 2 points, Basically, zombies and monsters in a big-ass mansion, there's a secret laboratory. Maybe thinking, come on, it's gotta be all these 2 games have in common. Well, it's not. And I hate to say this again, but the more reasons I state, the more I think it's gonna back up my silly little theory here. The third reason is because the human antagonist of both games is killed off by the final boss of each game. Didn't see that one coming, did you? Didn't decipher that one, did you? Didn't think those were 2 things that these games had in common. Now let me explain. First, House of the Dead. In House of the Dead, at the end of the game, the 2 playable characters, Rogan and G, confront Dr. Roy Curien, the antagonist of the game. Really, both games have human antagonists. The actual antagonist of the game isn't some zombie or monster. It really is a human. In House of the Dead, it's Dr. Roy Curien, the mad scientist behind basically the creation of all and the cause of all the shit happening in the mansion. Now, what happens after Rogan and G confront him, he releases his masterpiece, the Magician Type O, and he orders it to kill the player. Unfortunately, though, it basically says doesn't take orders from anyone, or at least a lower form of life, and it throws a fireball at Dr. Kurian, killing him. And then then you have to fight it. So in that game, the magician, the final boss, is released to kill the player, but kills the antagonist of the game first. In Resident Evil, I guess you could say the antagonist of the game, Albert Wesker, I think, ex-Umbrella operative. I don't know. I don't really know too much about Resident Evil besides these similarities. But the ex-Umbrella operative who's now working with stars, except isn't really. He's out for himself. Brings the player, depends on which character you're playing as, Chris or Jill, brings the player into another room in a secret underground laboratory where he reveals the Tyrant, this deformed humanoid monstrosity failure born straight from the T-virus. And he releases it and orders it to kill the player, but before it goes after you, it turns to Wesker, and with its big, spike, sharp, knife hand arm thing, it impales Wesker and kills him, and then goes after you. Fun fact, I think also both the Magician and the Tyrant are technically incomplete or something. And I think the Magician is incomplete, which is why it doesn't follow orders. The Tyrant was a failure. I guess that's not really a similarity. But my point is, the final boss of both games is released by the antagonist of the game, and the antagonist orders it to kill you, but it kills him first. And not only that, there's another odd similarity, not with those two specific games, but with both series in particular. The human antagonists of both the first games not only return eventually, but return as monsters. In House of the Dead 3, Dr. Kurian returns as the final boss, the Wheel of Fate. In Resident Evil, I think the next time he returns is in Code Veronica. And he's not a monster yet, he just has like T-virus powers or some shit. But I think in like Resident Evil 5 something happens and he becomes a monster that you have to fight. I forget if it's in gameplay or a cutscene. But yeah, so eventually the human antagonists of both games return further down the line and become a monster that you have to deal with at the end of another game. Now you're starting to see the really odd similarities here. I mean, forget, the human antagonists, returning. Just think about, them being killed off at the end of the game by the final boss that they released in order to kill the player. Now, the fourth similarity is when the games take place. Both games take place in 1998, which I find to be a really odd similarity. I mean, true. They do not take place in the same part of the year. Resident Evil just says July 1998. House of the Dead is, I believe, in like late December, but I still find it odd that they take place in the same year. And speaking of years, another really odd similarity, not so much I guess with the games themselves, but similarity number 5 is when the games were released. Both games were not only released in 1996, but in March of 1996. Let's think about that. Both games were released in the same month of the same year, and in both games, they take place in the same year in the slightly distant future. I don't know if someone ripped off someone else or if it was one big coincidence. And if you want to talk about even more coincidences, their sequels, House of the Dead 2 and Resident Evil 2, were released in 1998. Now, their sequels don't take place in the same time. I think Res 2 is only like a couple of months after the first game. House of the Dead 2 is like 2 years after the first game. And I know Res 2 was supposed to be released in 97, but got postponed, which I think is why they released the director's cut of the first game. But anyway, I find that an odd similarity too. Both sequels released in the same year. But again, forget about that for a minute and just look at the first games themselves. Released same month of the same year, and both games take place in the same year in the slightly distant future. Now starting to think that there's more similarities between these two games. Really odd ones. Again, I'm not trying to point fingers here and say Sega ripped off Capcom, Capcom ripped off Sega. But I want to know, you know, has anyone else noticed that? Does anyone else find that odd? Again, the reasons are, number one, you know, fighting zombies and monsters in a big mansion, basically a haunted house. Number two, all the monsters basically come from a secret laboratory in both mansions. Number three, the human antagonists of both games being killed by the final boss of each game as their order to kill the player. The fourth reason, both games take place in the same year. And the fifth reason, both games were released in the same month of the same year. Now, I was able to, I don't remember, but I was able to find the specific day Res 1 came out, and I wasn't able to find the specific day House of the Dead came out, though. So that's as far as I know. Again, I'm not here trying to say one is better than the other. House of the Dead, I'd say, is better, but that's not important right now. What is important is these really odd similarities. So, that's my video. I thought I'd put that out there, see if anyone else noticed it, and if someone out there really does know what happened or what's the deal, and go ahead, leave a comment, tell me. I'd like to know. So yeah, that's the similarities between House of the Dead and Resident Evil. So, I guess that's it. The link to that other channel I always mention, Iron Gear Studios, is in the description box below. Please check it out. It's a lot better than this channel. And, yeah. See you later, everyone.